If you participate, so we did this in the spring of this year, and if you participated that time, you'll remember it's a challenging venue because there's a lot of content to convey. I prefer it to be more conversational and interactive. That's a little bit tricky in a space like this with this many people, but we'll do our best. Try to make it a little bit interactive and also informational, but most importantly, edifying, right? We're here not to learn facts about the church, although that can be interesting. We're here to be built up in our faith, right? This is our family history. This is the story of us. We are the church. And so it's important for us to know that history, and it should, ideally, build our faith, make us more faithful today because we know about the history of our faith family, our church. So that's why we do this. Couple of other housekeeping type things. There is a handout. Looks like we ran out. I printed 40. I thought, seriously, not more than 40 people will want to talk about medieval theology. But it looks like that was a little low, so maybe Wally's making more copies. The packet has an outline for notes for all 4 of the church history classes, and it also has some supplemental readings for all 4 of the weeks. So if you have a handout, you're good to go for all of November. I always like to include some primary source readings, so not just reading about what happened in church history, which that's useful too, but reading people who wrote it when it happened, first-hand accounts, primary sources. So, for example, today our topic is the monastic movement. It was such an important movement in our faith family and in the history of our church. This movement where, like, anyone who was a serious Christian was joining a monastery or becoming a monk or a nun. That's part of our history. It was a little bit of a weird kind of moment in our family history, but it happened, and it's important for us to know about that. So that's what we're talking about today. And then included on that, I have included an excerpt of the Rule of Saint Benedict, which is the most well-known monastic order, Saint Benedict. And so you can read, what did he actually write? What did he envision these communities would be like? We can hear right from, because he wrote and because it's recorded, we can hear right from him. And we don't have to hear it from a secondhand source. Okay, so that's that. That's the handout. If you didn't get one, I think Wally is making more copies. Again, I'm surprised and delighted to see how many people are here. This class came up in our last council meeting about 3 weeks ago, and I can't remember the context, but I shared with our council that I'll be teaching adult ed for a month. And they said, what? And I said, the class is medieval theology. And they said, if you call it that, no one will come. And so, that's helpful feedback, right? So that's why that goofy title in the bulletin, I thought I'll just get back at them. And I call it The Empire Strikes Back. That has nothing to do with anything with this class. I just called it that to trick you into coming. So, all right. Let me pray, and then we'll dive right in. Lord, it's good to be together as a faith family. We thank you. We thank you for our immediate family, this church, and the people, the brothers and sisters that you've united us with in Christ to live out the Christian life. That's special and beautiful. And we thank you for our extended church family, the generations and the locations throughout the world of our wonderful, beautiful, extended church family. And I pray now as we think about this particular period of history, the medieval time, I pray that we'll learn some true things about what was happening, but far, far more important, I pray that we'll be edified and sanctified and encouraged in our faith and empowered by your Spirit to live it out as so many faithful and brave men and women have before. In Christ's name, amen. Okay. Well, if you want to know where we're going, so this is a 4-week, so the way that I break down this church history class is, this is a class that I used to teach in seminary so it's a master's level course, and then I broke it down into 4 kind of subunits, 4 courses of 4 weeks each. So we're in course number 2, the second one. We did the first one in the spring, and that was the Church Fathers. Now we're into course number 2, which is medieval history, medieval theology. And what we're going to cover, so today we'll do monasticism, the monastic movement. Next week, we're going to cover the actual medieval theology. I know we're used to thinking of medieval times as the Dark Ages. They weren't. There were some very smart, intelligent theologians doing good work during that time, and we're going to look at some of them. So we'll look at the theologians next week. Then week 3, we're going to look at kind of the ultimate church split, the Great Schism, which happened in 1054, which is when East split from West. Right? That was kind of the original church split. It's a very important incident that happened in our church history. So we'll talk all about that on week 3. And then week 4, we're going to start to see reforming movements. Everybody thinks that the Reformation kind of has a start date, 1517, October 31st, Martin Luther banging his 95 Theses. Sort of. That's not really when the Reformation started. Reformations started happening all over Europe around that time because it wasn't just Martin Luther that saw the problem, right? Lots of people were identifying this problem within the church, and lots of reforming movements began to happen around that time. And we associate it with Martin Luther because they kind of went all the way and formed the Protestant movement. But there were lots of reformations happening before then, so we'll talk about that. So that's the plan. That's where we're going. And we've got half an hour left today. So here we go. All right, white martyrdom. If you see that in your outline, that is point number 1, white martyrdom. That's what kind of monasticism itself was referred to as white martyrdom. So you can imagine red martyrdom is actually being killed and shedding your blood, martyrs. And if you were in the class in the spring when we covered patristics, the church fathers, you'll remember that there was, for the first 3 centuries of the church, there was just wave after wave of persecution and Christians dying for their faith. The last one was the Diocletian persecution. It was probably the worst one, and that was in 303. And that after that one, it was just 10 years later, in 313, that Christianity is made legal by Diocletian's, his successor, Constantine, made Christianity legal. So 10 years later, right? So all of a sudden now, when that happens, it's no longer illegal to be a Christian. That means it's no longer dangerous to be a Christian. It's perfectly acceptable. And when that happens, that kind of, for some people, that takes all the fun and the adventure and the romance out of the faith, right? It was exciting, this swashbuckling time when it was not legal to be a Christian and you had to meet in secret and under threat of possibly losing your life. And for a certain type of personality, that's thrilling. Right? And that feels like, wow, we're really doing something for God, right? We're putting our lives on the line. All of a sudden, that's taken away. It's not dangerous at all. In fact, it's encouraged. Go ahead and meet and worship God, right? That totally changed the dynamic. I can't overstate how suddenly different everything felt, right? And so as a result, some people started thinking, all right, well, if I can't, it's the ultimate sacrifice for God to lay my life down and to die for the faith. If that's off the table, well, then what would be next best? And a lot of people said, well, what would be next best would be white martyrdom. I'm not actually going to die, but I'm going to lay my life down and sacrifice it by dedicating it to a life of celibacy and prayer and asceticism, moving away from society. And so this movement kind of grew out of the lack of persecution. And so, of course, if you're a man, you become a monk and you join a monastery. And if you're a woman, you become a nun and you join a convent. And so there's 2 types of monastics. There are eremitical, if you see that on your outline. Eremitical monastics are hermits, solitary, right? You picture a lone monk sitting out in the desert by a cactus somewhere. That's an eremitical monk, okay? And the other option for monks and nuns is cenobitical. And the cenobitical one is the communal one, the monastery, the convent, lots of people together doing the same things. So those are your options. You're either eremitical or you're cenobitical. You're either alone or you're in a pack. Okay? But the monastic life, regardless, involves 4 basic values, 4 keys, right? So when this big movement is happening and so many people are becoming monks and nuns, kind of the pitch, kind of what you're signing up for when you choose that, as these 4 things. So 1, celibacy. That's baked into the vision here, right? So you're single and you're celibate. That was, at the time, singleness was not considered, like sometimes in our culture, this is not good and this is not biblical, but sometimes singleness is considered kind of second best or second calling, and it's almost like something to be cured, like you're single, you need to get married. That wasn't the attitude. That's not biblical. That's not healthy. But that wasn't the attitude early on in the church. In fact, it was considered an exalted status. If you're single, you're freed up. You're not encumbered by family. You're freed up to serve the Lord. So the monastic calling was a calling to singleness, which by definition, biblically, if you're single and you're trying to be faithful to the Bible, you're celibate. So it's a call to celibacy. It's also, second, a call to seclusion to varying degrees, right? So if you're an eremitical monk and you totally seclude, you don't even talk with anyone else ever. You're just totally off on your own. But some of the other cenobitical communes, they weren't totally secluded. First of all, they had one another. They were in community. But also sometimes they would interact. They would trade with the town, or they would receive visitors out. So it wasn't total seclusion, but there was kind of a continuum. But one way or another, you're kind of removing yourself from the regular world. Third, poverty. When you became a monk, you made a commitment to personal poverty. Monks were poor, by definition. Monks and nuns were poor, by definition. But the community could hold property. The community could have money. And so sometimes the community became very, very wealthy, right? Because all of these monks are working and producing things and selling them and generating income, but they have a personal commitment to poverty, so they're not keeping the money, they're not using the money, and it's kind of just going in the pool, going in the kitty. And so some of these monastic movements, kind of almost as a byproduct, not by design, not by intention, but as a byproduct, became very, very wealthy. And then that created this weird dynamic where it's like, well, the monks are all personally poor, they've taken a vow of poverty, and yet they're living in these very luxurious settings where there's loads of money because they're generating a lot of income. And that's kind of a weird dynamic that emerged. And then finally, the final value was work. And maybe when you hear work, you immediately think like labor, physical labor, and that was part of it. But also they considered their prayer work. That was part of their calling and part of their work. And so when monks would, pause their physical labor and gather together to chant psalms or to pray together, they didn't consider that they were stopping working and coming to pray. That's just a different form of their work. That's their vocation, their calling. So praying was part of their work. Doing physical labor in the field, or as a tailor or a cobbler, whatever, physical labor was part of the work. But then also academic work, copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, or writing theology if you're a theologian, or sometimes what they would do is one person would stand in the middle of the scriptorium and read a manuscript, and then he's surrounded, maybe you've seen like paintings of this, he's surrounded by monks who are just listening and copying and writing down what he's reading. So that kind of work. So you had academic work, you had your spiritual prayer work, and you had your physical manual labor. So that's the vision, those are the values that people are kind of it being pitched, and lots of people thought that was a very appealing vision of life, and became a part of that movement. So I'll talk about a couple of important kind of early monastic figures, and then I'll pause, and maybe we can interact a little bit. So one early one is St. Anthony. St. Anthony, his years, I can't remember if I put him in your outline. He lived a long life. Is it in there? Okay. So he lived a very long life, 251 to 356. And you can see by those dates that's right during the time when Christianity went from being an outlaw religion to being legal. It didn't, just to clarify, it didn't become the state religion of the Roman Empire until later, the year 380. It just became legal in 313. Not the state religion, but not illegal anymore. It's just legal in 313. And it's the state religion, the Roman Empire's official religion, not until 380. Okay, so St. Anthony is considered the father of the hermits, right? The eremitical monks, and he was located in Egypt, North Africa. Maybe a word about geography would be helpful here. As you picture the church spreading, right? The words of Jesus in Acts 1 should be ringing in your ears. Remember his final words to the disciples, you will receive power when the Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses. Remember, he has that concentric circle thing where he says in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, right? And so if you picture church history, you can kind of picture those circles radiating out from Jerusalem, and it expands. And if we were looking at a map and we had Jerusalem as the bullseye, and we kind of radiated out, we'd go east to Asia Minor, which is exactly what the Apostle Paul did, right? And he planted churches in Asia Minor. You could go west, and then you would hit Italy and Rome, and keep going west, and you kind of hit Spain, right? Which also we have. Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, and he was imprisoned in Rome, and he was wanting to go to Spain. You go north, you go into continental Europe, and even all the way up into England. But if you go south, we're kind of all around the Mediterranean Sea, right? But if you go south of the Mediterranean Sea, what do you hit? Africa. And so a lot of this early church history is actually taking place in Africa, in northern Africa. So St. Anthony was in Egypt. Or if you remember from last time in spring, St. Augustine, his ministry was in Africa as well, right? Of Hippo, Augustine of Hippo, which would be kind of modern-day Algeria. Okay, so we're in Africa, we're in North Africa, and we're with St. Anthony, and we're watching this eremitical monastic movement develop. So what happened for St. Anthony, he heard a sermon. So often in church history, it's someone hears a sermon and it changes their life. It encourages me every time I read that, right? God works through sermons. He changes people's lives. I always pray that on Sunday, that our lives will be changed by the preaching of God's word. Not my words, but sermons change lives. Sermons change history. Anyway, St. Anthony heard a sermon and it changed his life. And in this sermon, I think this sermon maybe wasn't great theology, but in the sermon it said that perfection in this life can be achieved by selling your possessions, giving to the poor, and following Christ, right? And so St. Anthony heard that. He was wealthy. He had inherited a fortune. He gave it all away in response to that sermon, just gave it away and began experimenting with retreating from society. And in the year 285, he retreated entirely. He just decided, I'm done with this. I'm going to go devote myself unto the Lord. And he went to the desert. And this is what happens so often with these guys and women who are feel this calling to go and be alone, devote their life to God until they die, is that they end up just being kind of natural leaders, even though they don't want to be. It's like a gift they don't want, but they can't give it back. And so they'll go to be on their own, and sure enough, people follow them, and people show up. And that's what happened to St. Anthony. He went to be alone, but people just flock. They just want to be near him. They want to be like him. They want to be with him. They want to learn from him. It's like me and Mr. Pope, right? Where you meet someone where it's like, something's happening with this guy, and I don't know what it is, but I want it. Right? That's how I felt with Mr. Pope, and so I just made it a point. I'm going to be, anytime I can, I'm going to be with him. Well, that's how a lot of these early founders of these monastic movements were people like that. And so whether they wanted it or not, they tended to attract a crowd. And so that's what happened with Anthony. And so he's generally, even though these movements were popping up all over, he's generally considered the first, kind of the trailblazer for this monastic movement. Another one of my favorites, just moving on for the purpose of time, is Saint Simeon, the Stylite. He's a classic. If there was baseball cards for church historians, his would be a valuable one. the stylite. So his years were getting a little later. He's 390 to 459. He lived in modern-day Syria, and he was experimenting with more and more radical forms of this eremitical, solitary monasticism. So first, what he did is he got away in a hut, just a little like shack, and he lived there for a year and a half. Same problem though, people just kept coming out. They knew where he was, they knew where the shack was, they kept coming. So then he moved further out. He like climbed a cliff and lived in like a crag in a mountain, like a little cave thing. But again, sure enough, people climbed and came and wouldn't leave him alone. They just want to ask him the meaning of life, or they just want to sit with him. So finally, he confines himself to sitting on a platform, just 1 square meter, a platform, on a pillar 50 feet in the air. He sets it up, he builds a pillar, he puts his platform up there, he goes up there, he sits down, and that's his thing, and he stays up there, are you ready for it? 37 years. Simon the Stylite sat on his pillar for 37 years. No one could come up there and bug him about the meaning of life up there. And so there he sat. He worked, if you're wondering how he ate, he worked out deals with the local boys and a pulley system. And so they would send up flatbread and goat's milk. That's what he lived on. And he was up there doing it for 37 years. And he died on September 2nd, 459. Now here's the bizarre thing, is that him going up on that pillar and sitting up there for 37 years, that sparked a bunch of imitators. And now all of a sudden, wherever you go, you see monks on pillars, like just sitting there, just praying or doing whatever they were doing. It was this like weird movement within our church family, historically our church family, where people thought the ultimate, like the best way to honor and glorify God with your life is to go sit on a platform up there and never come down. And so that happened. And then we'll talk about one more, and then we'll interact a little bit. St. Pachomius, 290 to 346. And he's important because he's often considered the father of the Cenobite movement, the more communal movement, the one that when we think of monks and nuns, kind of what we think of. So his deal is he served in the army. So often these people, their lives are revolutionized by hearing a sermon. Often also another kind of commonality in their backstory, a lot of the men were in the military. And that makes sense, right? Because the discipline, order, submitting to authority, all those things that are pounded into you in the military really work well in the monastery too, right? And so it makes sense that there's a parallel there. So he he was discharged from the military. He came to faith in the year 313. Important year, right? The first year that it's legal to be a Christian. He came to faith. And then he founded a monastery near the Nile River in the year 320. So shortly after, 7 years after coming to faith. He, again, large groups, everybody wanted a piece of him. A lot of people came. And so he kind of leaned, and a lot of these guys just didn't like it and kept moving further and further away. Pachomius kind of leaned into that, and he's like, all right, well, here we are. I'm here, you're here. We got to make this work. And so he wrote up an order, that word for the house. Like that's like house, an order is just house rules. All right, so he basically wrote the house rules. He's like, all right, you want to be here, let's make this work. And then he, turns out, was a good administrator. A lot of these guys are not good administrators. They're just kind of, that's just too practical. But Pachomius actually was. And so he ended up presiding over 9 different monasteries and 2 different convents, using the order, the house rules that he had written. And so those rules included, instructions about discipline and obedience and manual labor and silence and fasting and periods of prayer, everything. It was a comprehensive description of what life would be like. And people, that really appealed to people. Like, basically, when you join this order, you're done making decisions, right? If you're the kind of person that finds it overwhelming, or you get decision fatigue or something like that, this is perfect for you. Because you sign up and you're done making decisions. They're all made for you. When to talk, when to be quiet, what to eat, when to eat, what work to do, all covered, right? What you need to do is obey. That's it. That's your one decision. Decide to obey, you're done, right? And a lot of people, that really appealed to them. That really sounded good to them. So the way that it worked is you had three years probation just to figure out if this was a good fit, if this is really how you want to spend your life, as a way to, without penalty, kind of conveniently back off. If after 3 years it didn't suit you, then you can, no penalty, you can just step out. But if you're in after 3, then you're all in and you commit for life. And once you commit for life, after your 3 years probation, you're a full member, and that means that all of your property that you did own before then all goes to the community. It all belongs to the community, nothing for yourself. Meals are eaten together in silence, twice a week, everybody together. Fasts, everyone wears the same simple, cheap clothing. It has a hood. It's to keep people humble, and so nobody is like prideful about their appearance. 7 times a day, everybody comes together to pray together and to hear a Bible reading. And so the individual, like the whole vision here, right? With we all wear the same clothes. We put a hood so you can't express yourself with your hair. We eat the same food. The whole idea here is that the individual is being subsumed into the community, right? Which is not really something that Western people get super excited about, right? Because we like the verses that say we're fearfully and wonderfully made and we're unique and we're individual and all that, right? But that's kind of a Western mindset. But East, it's much more, the individual is less important than the community, right? And so you subsume your individuality into the community. That's good for you. That's good for your sanctification, right? That's a way of denying yourself and taking up your cross and following Jesus. And so that was kind of the vision. It was like built-in humility into the project. And so, as I've mentioned over and over again, this was all the rage. This was like people who were really serious and committed about their faith and about giving their life to the Lord tended to go this way, to a monastery or to a convent. So I guess I want to pause here. You've heard an awful lot of my voice this morning and interact a little bit. We don't have a ton of time. I was hoping we could go into smaller groups, but I don't think we're going to have time for that. So I guess what I want to encourage here, whenever I'm studying church history, I want to take the good, I want to learn from the good and apply the good, and there's good from every stage, from every generation of church history, from every movement within the church. There's good to be gleaned and to applied, but I want to avoid the bad, right? There's always negatives too. I mean, church history, like any kind of history, is always this pendulum of overcorrection one way and then overcorrection the other way, right? And so when I think about this monastic movement, I'm not a monk, so that's not going to be my application. I'm not going to join a monastery. But what was good about the impulse there, and what can I harness in my own life as a disciple of Christ, and what was maybe unhealthy and what I want to get away from? So answer either one, answer the positive or answer the negative, but let's just brainstorm a little bit before we move on. What do you see here? It's either good, worthy of imitation, or unhealthy. Anybody? Yes?
Prayer was a really vital part of everyone's life, not just something you fit in the morning or at night, but in the daytime.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Sandy, and also, yeah, like she's saying, like prayer was baked into the daily schedule so that you specifically would pray throughout the day, right? There were 8 traditional times for prayer that these monasteries would pause and get together and pray throughout the day. They got that number, like from the Psalms, there's these prayers that say like morning and evening, I'll pray to you. Or there's one Psalm that says 7 times a day, I'll pray to you. And it was actually St. Benedict that took that idea and then broke it down into, okay, well, we'll do that exactly at these times. We'll gather, and that's the office, the hours, the liturgy of the hours, and that's when you pray throughout the day. And one of the benefits and blessings of that is that I don't know if you've ever tried to pray the hours. I have. It's really hard to do. But you're constantly, throughout the day, being recentered on God and orienting your whole schedule around your times of prayer. Instead of what most of us do is orient our prayer around our schedule, right? And that is a big difference, and it is a big blessing to do it the other way. Okay, what else? Good or bad?
The requirement of celibacy for being a devoted Christian seems to have become a big downfall of the Catholic Church because of the failings of maintaining the celibacy.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church seems to still hang on to that so tightly. It seems to be a problem for many.
Yeah, it definitely. Yeah, you're right. That's a good point. That has that. Oh yeah, sorry. I'll just repeat what you said in case anyone didn't hear it. This idea, this emphasis and celebration of celibacy and requiring people who want to live out this life to do it celibate has ended up causing all kinds of problems within the church, as we well know and don't need to recite here. But this idea that if you're called to serve the Lord, the ultimate calling, right, the ultimate status is to be celibate. And anyone who's called to serve the Lord in that way is also called to celibacy. That can cause all kinds of problems, right? Because the reality is we're not all called to celibacy. Some people are. And if you try to force fit that calling onto you when you're not called to it, that can create all sorts of problems. That's a good point. Anything else on the positive or the negative? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So did you hear that? The Matthew 5, the be salt and light, to let your light shine, to be engaged in the world, to these phrases we hear, to be in the world but not of the world. Well, the monastic impulse is exactly the opposite of that. The monastic impulse is to remove yourself from the world, right? And so that is an ongoing critique throughout the church of people who think monasticism is maybe not a great idea, is that very point, is that, well, don't we have this commission to engage the world? We should not be removing ourselves from the world. In fact, when we get to the Reformation, the Reformers, in a lot of ways, are responding to this monastic movement. As you know, Martin Luther was a monk, and he married a former nun. And one of the big points they made was exactly the point that you're making, Anna, where they were saying, no, but we're supposed to transform culture. We're supposed to be engaged. We've got the good news. We should bring it, not remove it. So yeah, anything. Mm-hmm.
Exact opposite of impulse in your sermon today. All the gifts of this life are kind of taken away.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, so it's purposely choosing to spurn the good gifts that God's given us, right? Saying that I know God's given us, all kinds of wonderful foods to eat and music to listen to and all of these things, but it's as if it's somehow meritorious to live this ascetic and life of suffering, as if somehow that's pleasing to God. And again, there's a continuum, but some monks really got to the point where they thought it was very much, God was very, very pleased with them, the more uncomfortable they could make their life, right? So they would wear these hair shirts where they would get hair from goats and put it on the outside of a shirt and then turn that shirt inside out and wear it all day. And it would be very, very itchy and scratchy and uncomfortable. And somehow that was supposed to, me making my skin uncomfortable all day, was somehow to be God really loves that. That's really good. And it's exactly opposite, right? What we see in the Bible and what we heard this morning is that God gives us gifts to bless us. God loves to bless his children. And so this idea that, but the really spiritual ones, they don't need that, right? They're good with just, a bowl of rice and an itchy robe. There's nothing in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible that teaches that, and yet that was pitched as God's really going to be pleased with you.
One thing that just comes to mind is that, I don't know where it is in the Bible, but I think when the Pharisees came up to Jesus and he pointed out how John the Baptist
right? You call him crazy because he only ate locusts, he lived in the wild, right? But now you call me a drunkard because I know that John was sinners, right? So I kind of think about that, like John the Baptist kind of was. I mean, he interacted with people, right?
For sure.
But he definitely didn't engage in all these gifts of God either.
Yeah, really good point, Tara. I hope everyone heard that. But she was talking about, like, there is biblical precedent in John the Baptist and others who purposefully forego some of the blessings and comforts of this world in order to live a life devoted to God. That's absolutely right. And I guess what I would say to that is, first of all, that's a calling, right? Some people have that calling, but not everyone does. And secondly, it's my belief is that, yes, John the Baptist purposely lived an ascetic life to the glory of God. I bet he was joyful, though. I bet he was not a long-faced, sour-faced Christian who thought that somehow it's awesome to suffer. And the more we can suffer and the sadder we can be, the happier God will be. I'm quite sure he didn't live a life like that, right? So there is joy in this world, and we are to be joyful. But yeah, some people are called to that aesthetic vision. That's a good point.
I would guess that a lot of inspirational writing, so thoughts came from the people who lived this life. We have writers of people that are really helpful.
Yeah, great point. Like these people, the people that did choose the monastic option and separate themselves from the world and live the life of contemplation and prayer, they had some good thoughts. Right? They had some good insights. They had some hard-won wisdom. And thankfully we have books of people that wrote these things down. So I'm glad someone said a positive one, because we're not here to pile on monks or to say that it's awful. Right? And some good things came out of it. One of which is cutting through the static, like all the noise of the world, and like getting to a place of a little bit more peace. You can hear from God. You can have real insights from God, and that's a blessing. Way in the back.
They preserve scripture by writing it down.
Yeah, they loved the Bible. They preserved the Bible. They spent significant hours copying scriptures. We can be very, very grateful for that.
When it gave some people did the group thing, it gave them a community that they might not have had outside of being in that center.
Yeah.
They might have not found any community.
Yeah. Community and the relationships that form. And I think that's one thing, right? The Cenobitical, obviously not the Eremitical, but the Cenobitical, like they valued community. Even the places where they had silence, they still had relationships and they still had community. And what I've experienced is that Christians that I've talked to, like that's deep. Like we want community. We're wired for community. So many metaphors in the Bible for Christians are about community, right? The body. We're all the different parts of the body forming one body. And so I think there's a longing in our hearts, and some people, church on Sunday morning is great. I hope we all love it. I hope it's the highlight of the week for everyone. But it's just church on Sunday morning, right? And to be living in a community 7 days a week, all day, building those relationships, working together, praying together, living together, that's powerful. And like there's something in our hearts that longs for that. And so the Cenobitical monastic tradition really did get community right in a way that I think we can be a little bit jealous of, really. Okay, yep.
One question. How did monastic either perpetuate or expand any heresies? Because if you're alone, but maybe you're writing, but how would that? To me, that seems like it could be a problem because you're not communicating as thoroughly.
Yeah.
With others that, at least as far as a counter true doctrinal.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question's being raised about like being in a monastic setting and then heresies kind of developing and spreading in that context.
Not necessarily in the monastic, but outside of that. If they're studying scripture, if they're writing it,
yeah.
how would that them being separated
Yeah.
contribute to heresy.
The more like the hermits or yeah. So with the eremitical ones, where you're just you're just sitting in a cave somewhere for 20 years. It's like, how do you not come up with heretical ideas, or like what's the checks and balances? Kind of, is that the question? Yeah. And the reality is that happened. And some of these people that went off and like heard from God while they were living in a cave did come up with some crazy ideas. And that was one of the benefits of the communal ones, where they were in order, they had official sanction from the church, right? And the church then would oversee their life and doctrine and make sure it was kind of in line with what the church teaches. But yeah, some of these eremitical hermits, they just came up with whatever they came up with, and some of it was pretty bonkers, actually, yeah. A lot of heresies came out of the desert, that's for sure. Okay. Whoa, we're out of... Well, we can't stop. All right, now what do I do? Okay, all right. Okay, I'm gonna tell you one more thing. It'll be short, and then we'll be done. And you can read Saint Benedict's rule on your own this week and think more about monks and nuns and how that relates to your life. I just want to say one thing, is that a movement, because this will be important for the Reformation, a movement within the church developed within the monastic communities of mendicants. Now, mendicants, those were monastics, usually men, usually monks, who felt like their calling was to go and preach. These were preaching movements. And so the mendicants, and the most important were the Franciscans, St. Francis, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans, both of which we still have, felt like they didn't want to be locked up in the monastery, that they weren't useful to God in that setting. And so it was a whole movement that committed to sending out preachers into the country, into the countryside and into the communities that could preach God's word and hear confessions. And so it was basically an evangelism movement within the church to go out and preach the gospel and to see people come to faith, right? That mendicant evangelist movement of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, that's going to very closely lead to the reforming movement that ends up becoming Protestantism. So just keep that in mind. It's not a straight line, it's maybe a little bit of a crooked line, but there is a line between this monastic movement within the church and the Protestant movement that comes just a little bit later. Okay, enough for now. Thanks for coming. Thanks for listening. Have a good week. We'll see you.